So for this video, I'm going to be discussing the worst and most disappointing reads of 2024. So these are either just the worst books that I read in 2024, or these are the most disappointing books. And I tried to narrow it down to 10, but what I've done is I've compiled 13 of the worst and most disappointing. And I'm going to make those distinctions because some of these books are like the worst books that I read, like books that I really didn't enjoy. And then some of these books were just disappointing for various reasons. They're not the worst books I've read, but they were disappointing, like I said, for reasons that I'll get into. And I'm not going to include any of the books that I DNF'd this year because obviously those are probably the worst and most disappointing. I'm going to instead make a separate video for all the books that I DNF'd that'll come out later in the month. But yeah, these are 13 of the worst and most disappointing books that I actually finished and read in 2024. 2024, wow, in 2024. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with an author that I've read all of his books from, and I've enjoyed most of them, but definitely a handful of them have not been my favorite. And probably my least favorite that I've read so far that I read in 2024 was Final Girls by Riley Sager. And like I've mentioned, I've read a ton of his books, and actually one of his books is going to make my best of the year video, which will come out in a few days here from now. But this one, Final Girls, was his debut novel, and I'd heard some people say that if you're kind of brand new to thrillers, this book would probably be a pretty good thriller to start out with. But if you're more of a seasoned thriller consumer, reader, and someone who's a big fan of horror, I've heard that this book might not be the best for you, and that was definitely my experience. I really didn't get along with this book. It wasn't terrible, but I did give it 2.5 stars. I was hoping to like it a bit more. I was hoping that I would like it as much as some of, his other books that I really liked, House Across the Lake, Home Before Dark, like some of his really good ones. But this one has definitely been my least favorite so far. The protagonist was not very compelling. The mystery aspect wasn't very compelling either. There just wasn't a lot of compelling stuff in this book for me. I know it's a thriller book, but I kind of wished he would have delved a little bit more into the horror side of things, because if you call a book Final Girls, like the term Final Girl is definitely a slasher horror term. So I was hoping that this would have a bit more horror elements to it. It's basically about a girl who is a final girl and survived someone attacking her and killing a bunch of people. But, not really much about the horror, really just kind of a stereotypical thriller and not a very interesting one at that. I know a lot of people love this book, but yeah, this is definitely one of my least favorites. This probably his first two books, really, Final Girls and The Last Time I Lied. Those ones just I really didn't get along with very well, and this one definitely one of the more disappointing reads of 2024. This next book is just definitely one of the worst books that I read all year. It's called Intercepts by T.J. Payne. And this book initially intrigued me just from the premise alone. It's all about this guy who works at this kind of secret place that's all about human experimentation and that kind of deal. It kind of, like at the start of the book, it felt like it was going to read kind of like a Dean Koontz book. And I read a lot of Dean Koontz in my younger college days. I plowed through a bunch of his books, and a lot of Dean Koontz stuff has like secret government agency kind of stuff. So this book felt like it could be kind of one of those books. And this book dealt with a lot of kind of sensory deprivation stuff, which again, a very heavy topic for Dean Koontz in a lot of his books. But man, this book just, I'm finding that if I can't get really attached to at least one of the characters, I'm going to have a bad time. Even if some interesting stuff is happening, like if you give me a bland protagonist or just a group of characters that I cared nothing about, I'm not going to have a good time. And this book was no exception. I didn't care at all, and it honestly just felt like a watered down kind of Dean Koontz copy. Like it definitely felt like something Dean Koontz would have written in like the 80s, but this one just kind of felt like a carbon copy and not a very good one. So overall, this book was just very unentertaining, and I really did not have a good time with it, and I gave it 2 stars. Another thriller that I did not have a good time with was All the Missing Girls by Megan Miranda. And this was actually, I think, our March pick for Thrill Chill or Kill Book Club. If you don't know, every month me and Stacy choose a random thriller, horror, mystery book to read in the month where we can all kind of come together and do a big buddy read for it. And this was our pick for March for 2024. And this one was the only one that I gave a kill rating. So a thrill is really good, a chill is like meh, and then kill is like kill it with fire. This was the only book that I gave a kill rating. I gave it 2.5 stars. And the gimmick of this book is that the book is told in backwards order. So you kind of start at the present day and then you kind of work your way back. It starts out at like day 14 and then you work your way up till day 1, and you're supposed to figure out the mystery kind of backwards. Where really it should have just been told forward, because the very beginning of the book was very boring, very mundane, and then like you get to the very end and you realize what's kind of going on. And for me, it should have just started that way. Like if you would have started with that premise and then worked your way up, it would have been pretty good. But by the time I got to the point where I was somewhat interested, like you just bored me throughout the whole book. So really, this book should have just been told in regular fashion, and I think it would have been pretty serviceable. But the way it was written, it was just very gimmicky, and I really did not have a good time with it. And I gave it 2.5 stars. Another book that was one of the worst books that I read and a huge disappointment was Whale Fall by Daniel Kraus. This book I had been looking forward to reading for quite a while. It's narrated by my favorite narrator, Kirby Hayborn. So I was like, well, if it's bad, I can at least, enjoy his narration, which, to be fair, that's mainly the main reason why I got through this book was Kirby Hayborn. If it was anything else, probably would have been DNF'd, because good God, this book was just bad. So, and there's a lot of reasons for it too. So first off, this book has a really cool premise of this guy getting trapped inside a whale, and he has to figure out how to get out of the whale and survive. It had comparisons to Michael Crichton, which is fair because Michael Crichton writes a lot of books like this where it's very technical. But this one, I think it just tried to do too many things. Also, it has very short, choppy chapters, which if you've watched my channel this year, I basically figured out that I don't love short, choppy chapters, and that will come up again in this video. But yeah, it was like an 8-hour audiobook, and it had like 200 chapters or some crap. It was just ridiculous. And the way that the story was told, it was constantly flipping back and forth between the present and the past, and some of these chapters were literally like 1 or 2 minutes. So it's just like a little bit in the present, a little bit in the past, a little bit in the present, just constant back and forth. And it really did nothing for me. And the actual writing of the book was not very good. The main character, again, wasn't very compelling. So just really nothing about this book besides Kirby Hayborn's narration was good. Like that was the only thing that kept me going. And yeah, this book was just bad. Very disappointing. And yeah, I gave it 2 stars. Big bummer. Next book I have to talk about, definitely one of the worst books and fairly disappointing, even though I was a little hesitant going in. So I didn't really have high expectations for this book, but it was still a little disappointing. And that would be The Villa by Rachel Hawkins. Now, my journey with Rachel Hawkins is that I loved the first book that I read by her, The Wife Upstairs. That's still one of my favorites. I'm almost afraid to go back and reread it just because I've had such a bad time with her other books. Maybe if I go back and reread it, I won't like it as much. So I'm a little scared about that. But that book I thoroughly enjoyed, gave it 5 stars. And then I tried to read one of her other books, Reckless Girls, and had a bad time with that too. Gave that book like 2.5 stars. So with this one, this was kind of like a make or break for me. Like if I love this book, I'll try to continue to read her books. And if I don't get along with it, cutting her off. And this book I gave 2 stars. Thoroughly did not enjoy it. The main characters were not good. And the whole time, I'm just kind of waiting for the shoe to drop. I'm waiting for, I kept waiting for it to get going. And it just never did. And I thought at points that it would try to get more interesting, or like it would go in a certain direction, and it was just so stagnant. And then you finally get to the end and something interesting has happened, and then you cut away from it. And it happens off screen. And it infuriated me so much that just I hate this book. Gave it 2 stars. And yeah, this book, I'm not reading any more Rachel Hawkins. I own The Wife Upstairs just because I love that book so much. I'm afraid to go back and reread it because now I'm thinking maybe I read it wrong or maybe I don't know. But yeah, The Villa by Rachel Hawkins, one of the worst books I read this year. I gave it 2 stars. This next book was not really disappointing because like I said, I did not go into this book with high expectations, but it was kind of a make it or break it moment for this author. I've read several of this author's works, or I've attempted to read several by this author, and I thought maybe this one would be the one to get me into his work, but it just did not happen. And that's this the book I'm talking about is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. The one book that I kind of enjoyed by him was The Ocean at the End of the Lane. And even that book I didn't love. I gave that book like 3.5 stars. And then a lot of his other books I've tried, I've DNF'd. I just don't love his writing style. And this one I thought could be interesting because I kind of knew going in what the book was about a little girl named Coraline who kind of finds this like alternate family of hers that's a lot different and a lot spookier. So I thought this book could kind of be interesting and could maybe compel me to read more of his stuff, but this book was ultimately just very boring. I kind of liked the main character of Coraline, but all of the other characters surrounding her were very boring. The events of this book were boring. The writing wasn't like I just don't like Neil Gaiman's writing. And yeah, so he's definitely an author that I'm just cutting off. I'm not going to try any more of his stuff. He's just not the author for me. So yeah, Coraline, not a terrible book, but I really didn't have a good time with it. I gave it 2.5 stars. This next book was definitely not the worst book that I read all year, but one of the more disappointing because I had read a couple of his other books in the past and really enjoyed them. And this book just really just dropped the ball and I did not really enjoy it that much. And that would be Witch by Ian Rob Wright. Now, he's written some pretty good books called Escape was really good. That was like 4.5 stars. Also, Ian Rob Wright is a indie horror author. Really fast, really short, but punchy horror books. And Escape was really good. And then his other book that I read, Dark Ride, was also really good. So I was jumping into this one, which was actually the first book in this series. It's the first book in the Cursed Manuscript series. And I will just say at the very front, there is no mention of any cursed manuscripts in this book. So I was very perplexed the whole time of like, what does this have to do with cursed manuscripts? But whatever. That's not even the main problem with this book. The main problem is that Ian Rob Wright just does not know how to write kid characters. Like there's some authors that I love, like Stephen King, for example. Most of the time he's able to write very compelling children and kid characters. Same thing with George R. R. Martin. But some authors just do not do it very well. And Ian Rob Wright, his other books that didn't come across because all of the characters were adults and they were written very well. This book, the two main characters are both children, and he did not write them very well. They did not sound or act like children in any way, and it really took me out of the story. Also, the story itself wasn't as compelling as his other books, so pretty disappointing. I thought this was going to be a start to a new series I was going to enjoy, but this book just did not land very well for me. I did give it 3 stars. It wasn't terrible by any means, but I'm not reading any more of that stuff. I'll read more of his standalone stuff because so far those have been really good. But this book just was very disappointing, and I gave it 3 stars. And this next book was definitely one of the worst books that I've read all year. Not disappointing because I had pretty low expectations, and they were met because it's a pretty low-rated book. I'm talking about Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. I've tried to read some of his stuff in the past, and just his writing, I can't get into. And the same thing with this book. I thought this would be a better starting place than maybe some of his other books because I've seen the movie, and the movie, while it was never one of my favorites, it was still good for what it was. So I at least already knew the story. But again, just the writing style, I don't even know how to pinpoint what it is, but I just don't like his writing style. And I really did not enjoy my time with this book. And definitely one of those cases where the movie does the book better. Like there's a lot of instances of horror movies where just I would rather watch the movie, like Jaws, The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, Silence of the Lambs. Like for some reason, just sometimes horror movies just work better as a movie rather than a book. And this is definitely one of those instances for me. Although I don't know if this is necessarily a horror movie book, but it's, I didn't really like the book, is what I'm trying to say. I gave it 2 stars. Definitely one of the worst books I've read all year. Next book I have to talk about, definitely one of the worst books I've read all year. This book really infuriated me. This book is called The Night Guest. I don't remember the author, and probably I can't pronounce their name anyway, but this book was a very short audiobook that I listened to. And again, guys, short, choppy chapters. This book, I believe, is less than 3 hours on audio, but it had 100 chapters, and it got. I'll start from the beginning though. The reason I'm not giving this lower than 2 stars, I gave this book 2 stars, is because it did have a promising start. It's all about this woman who her energy is drained. She's feeling exhausted every day, and she doesn't really know what to do. She doesn't know what's causing it. She doesn't know what's wrong with her. She's trying to figure it out. And the whole time, the author's kind of making it seem like maybe something paranormal is happening. So the first few chapters were pretty interesting, learning about her life, learning about the things that are going on. It started out pretty well. And then you get to the point where the author is literally writing 1-sentence chapters. It literally got to the point where it was like chapter 65. Chapter 66. Chapter 60. I'm like, what are you doing? You can't write a 1-sentence chapter over and over again. Oh, this book was infuriating. And, this book is infuriating. It just skipped over so much stuff. Like this book, if it would have been like more fleshed out, like you could even like write a 5-hour, 6-hour novella, like just flesh it out more. But like you got to the interesting part and they literally had 1 sentence. So yeah, this book, if you couldn't tell, just infuriated the crap out of me with these short, choppy chapters, literally 1-sentence chapters. And yeah, overall, this book was just bad. I really didn't enjoy it, and I gave it 2 stars. If it didn't have a strong start to it, it probably would have gotten 1 star. So yeah, this book was just bad. And now we come across some books that I actually own physically because I haven't done an unhaul yet. All of these books are going to be unhauled. This book was one of the most disappointing books and one of the worst books that I've read all year. And that would be Never Lie by Frida McFadden. Super disappointing because I've read 2 of her books. The Housemaid, which is 5 stars, one of the best thrillers I've ever read. And then the sequel to that, The Housemaid's Secret, is what it's called. The Housemaid's Secret. That one was pretty good, 4.5 stars. So two really solid thrillers. And then I wanted to check out one of her standalones, and I picked this up just randomly, and it was bad. It was really bad. It starts out, typical, like this couple wants to buy a house, but there's a lot of weird things happening. It could be haunted. There could be someone there. Blah, blah, blah. Like the premise, read it a million times or watched it a million times. That wasn't really the problem. Like it was fine until you get to the closer to the ending and you realize that the author has basically been misleading you the whole time, and just the way that it happens makes no sense, and it's just baffling that anybody could give this book 4 or 5 stars. Like I get it maybe if this is like one of the very first thrillers you've ever read, but for a seasoned thriller reader like myself, and frankly a lot of people, like, how can you enjoy this book? Explain to me that, because you get to the end of this book and you're just like, how? How does this make any damn sense? So yeah, this book was extremely frustrating and just one of the most, if not the most disappointing books, because I had loved her previous books and now I'm kind of scared to read more of her standalones, because if it's going to be like this, I'm in for a rough ride here. But yeah, this book was just bad and disappointing. 2 stars. And this next book, I wouldn't necessarily consider it a terrible book, but it was disappointing because I had very high expectations for it. And that would be Blackmouth by Ronald Malfi. This book had a lot of comparisons to It by Stephen King, which, to be fair, is not one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, but it is a book and a story with great characters and a great villain that I overall do enjoy. So if you're going to compare a book to like a classic horror masterpiece like it better live up to the expectations. And it really did not. The story itself is somewhat comparable because you've got, in the past, you had these kids have a run in with someone or something in their past that, really spooked them. And now they're all adults kind of returning to this town that they used to live in, and they kind of have to face it again. So very similar premise. Problem is, or the main problem is that the antagonist in this book, the villain, is just extremely uncompelling. And to compare a book like this to it, where you have Pennywise, one of the most iconic horror villains ever, and then you get a book like this with the villain is just so uncompelling. The whole book, I'm just like, is the villain gonna just do something interesting here? And really, he doesn't. And it's just this book was just extremely underwhelming. And I only read this book like a couple of months ago. I've already lost most of the details just because this book was just so boring, and the characters weren't very good. And that's another thing. Some of the best character work that Stephen King's ever done in it. And then you get this book. It just did not live up to expectations. So very disappointing. Not terrible, but I did give it 2.5 stars. And yeah, I was very disappointed. And now we're going to end the video with an author that gets 2 books on this list. So this is definitely an author that I'm not reading any more of their stuff. I'll start out with the book that we read in November for Thrill, Chill, or Kill. That would be Good Girls Don't Die by Christina Henry. In this book I was excited about. I won't get into like what exactly it's about, but the structure of this book was really interesting. So you're following three different women who are all kind of in their own story, and they get told in parts 1, 2, and 3. And then part 4 is kind of the convergence of those stories. But part 1 of this book was awesome. Like, if I was just rating that part, 5 stars. I was super compelled with that. And then you get to the second woman's story. It's pretty good. It'd be like more of a 4-star. Like if that was a book, it'd be like a 4-star book. And then you get to part 3, kind of 3 stars. So like already you're like, it's getting lower and lower here. And then you get to part 4 where all of these women's storylines kind of converge, and then you kind of get the reveal of what's going on, and 1 star. Terrible. Just one of the worst endings to a book I've ever read. The antagonist was just Scooby-Doo level goofy. And yeah, this book was just off. It had such a promising start. Like, I wish Christina Henry would have just took that part 1, fleshed it out a bit more, and just wrote that book, because that book would have been amazing. But nope, it just tanked and tanked and tanked until it just reached rock bottom. And yeah, this book, while it's not a terrible book, I'd settled on 3 stars, but good God, that ending, it was just horrible. But yeah, this book was pretty bad. And then for some reason, I decided to pick up her other book that I was interested in, Near the Bone, also by Christina Henry. And this book, it's hard for me to say that this is a bad book, because I know people had a great time with it, and objectively, not a bad book. But me personally, like my own personal experience reading this book, is such a Debbie Downer. This book is all about a woman who's in an abusive relationship, who lives with an abusive husband in a cabin in the woods in the snowy mountains. Like, no one's around for miles, and she's just in a really crappy situation. And then, so like, she also has no agency, and just, this book is just, it really infuriated me. It was such a Debbie Downer experience. And then, the interesting part of this book is that, they're alone in the woods, but then all of a sudden they hear about this creature, and then they see it like attacking. They don't see anything, but they see animals that have been attacked by something. They know it's not a bear, and then they go into a cave and they realize like, oh, this creature has some sort of intelligence. So the whole mystery of this book is like, what is this creature? How are they going to stop it? And then you get further on, And it's just such a Debbie Downer book. And like, yeah, I don't know. It was just not a fun experience. I love reading books that are that can be sad and depressing, but they've got to have something that I can attach to like have a fun experience reading it. And really, this whole book was just sad. Like, it was just a sad experience reading this book. I keep saying Debbie Downer, but like that's what this book is. And then on top of that, the cherry on top of that is you get to the ending of this book, and nothing is really explained. It just wraps up really quickly, and no bows are tied. It's just a very baffling experience. I really did not enjoy this book. I gave it 2 stars. I can get why some people love this book, but it just was not for me. I really was disappointed, and one of the worst books that I personally read. All right, so those are all 13 of my worst and or disappointing books that I read in 2024. So to just recap, Final Girls by Riley Sager, 2.5 stars, probably his worst book that I've read. Intercepts by TJ Payne, just a really bad book in my mind. All the Missing Girls, super disappointing, gave it 2.5 stars. It should have just been told in regular order instead of backwards order. Whale Fall by Daniel Kraus, one of the worst books and one of the most disappointing books, just super bad book. The Villa by Rachel Hawkins, never again am I reading another book by her, unless it's The Wife Upstairs, unless I want to attempt to reread that book. But The Villa, 2 stars. Coraline, again, I'm cutting off Neil Gaiman. No more Neil Gaiman. Not the writer for me. Witch by Ian Rob Wright. I will read more from him, but not in this series, because this series just no. Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. He's definitely not an author for me either. Definitely one of the worst books I read. And then The Night Guest, possibly the worst book I've read. It's like 2.5 hours on audio, but it just infuriated me so much. Never Lie by Frida McFadden. I will read more from her, but hopefully this is just one book. Hopefully this is just one dud, and hopefully the rest of her books are good. But this book was just bad. And then Blackmouth by Ronald Malfi. Super disappointing books. I was really expecting that book to live up to expectations, and it sadly just fell flat, and I didn't like it. And then 2 Christina Henry books. Good Girls Don't Die. Terrible ending, but really promising start. So I was kind of hoping that her books would be for me, but after Near the Bone, that book was just, I had such a down time reading that book, and I really didn't like it. So Christina Henry is also out. So yeah, those are my worst and most disappointing books for various reasons. So yeah, what did I learn? I really don't like short, choppy chapters. I really enjoy great character work, and if you have a boring book with bad characters, I'm not going to have a good time. But yeah, and also just having really high expectations in general can sometimes lead to bad results. So maybe I should try to tamper my expectations a little bit and not have like super high expectations for books. But yeah, overall, these were 13 just bad books that I had bad times with. And like I mentioned, I have already filmed my DNF video, so that'll come out probably next week. I have 22 DNFs to talk about. I didn't want to mention those with this because this video would just be like an hour long, and I didn't want that to happen. So I'm going to save all my DNFs for one video. Those are all the books that I did not finish in 2024. But for this video, let me know what your opinions are on the books that I mentioned here, the books that I consider to be worst and disappointing. Did you have a good time with these, or do you agree with me and think that these books were bad? Comment down below, and also, what were the worst and most disappointing books for y'all in 2024? I want you to comment those down below. We're going to have a fun chat about it. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and continue to subscribe to this channel, Bookish Drummer, and Bookish Drummer Discord, where, like I've mentioned, we've got the Thrill, Chill, or Kill book club, which, you know, some of these books were on there, so it happens. But anyway, I've also got my Patreon link down below if you want to go support me there for as little as $1 a month, and I've got my Amazon wishlist if you want to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.